Welcome to this deep dive.
Hello.
Today we are continuing our ongoing series, In Search of the Optimal System.
Right.
And we have a very specific focus today. We're looking at a concept called deep transparency.
The end of the black box, as they call it.
Exactly. We're going to take a methodical look at a proposed, really quite fundamental shift in how societies handle public funds.
Yeah, it's a shift that challenges the very mechanics of how governments spend money.
Yeah.
We are looking at the built-in obfuscations of our current municipal and national budget systems.
Because we often assume that just because a budget is published online, well, that it's transparent.
Right, but as we will explore today, there's a massive difference between data availability and genuine financial accountability.
There really is. And once we establish the failures of the current system, we'll break down a new technological architecture designed specifically to fix them.
Exactly.
So the foundation for today's exploration comes from a university workshop that tackled this exact problem. The session featured Professor Vojanjank and guest speaker Professor Dujan Pavlovich.
Alongside a technical architectural solution designed by Yevko Bujovic.
Right. And our mission today is to thoroughly unpack what they call deep transparency. We want to understand the history of how state ledgers have been hidden from you, the public.
And why our current digital systems are essentially an illusion.
Yes, and how a combination of specific existing technologies could fundamentally alter the relationship between you, the citizen, and the state apparatus.
To understand where this technical solution is going, though, we first have to ground ourselves in the philosophical starting point of their presentation.
Right, the assumption of sovereignty.
Exactly. Professor Pavlovich opens his portion of the workshop with this core premise. He terms it the assumption of sovereignty. And the premise is stark. It dictates everything that follows.
Which is that the state does not actually have its own money.
None.
Yeah.
Zero. Aside from the mechanical act of printing currency, the state is effectively broke.
Right. And obviously printing currency triggers its own set of complex economic consequences.
With inflation.
Exactly. But aside from that, the funds that the state holds are generated entirely by you, the citizen.
They are extracted through income taxes, property taxes,
administrative fees, customs duties.
Right, a myriad of fiscal mechanisms. But it sounds elementary when stated so directly, doesn't it?
It does, but it's a concept that routinely vanishes in modern political rhetoric.
It absolutely does.
We hear phrases all the time like, the government is funding this project.
Or the city is paying for this new initiative.
Right. But the psychological distance between the taxes deducted from your paycheck and the money spent by a municipal government is vast.
And Pavlovich stresses this assumption of sovereignty, specifically to collapse that distance. If the state does not possess its own wealth, then the national or municipal budget is exclusively the citizens' collective money.
It's your money.
Exactly. And furthermore, that money is collected under a strict social contract. It is intended solely for the common good and the functioning of the community.
Right. And because of that mandate, the owner of that money...
The citizen.
Yes. The citizen retains the absolute non-negotiable right to know every single detail of how it is spent.
The state, in this view, is not some benefactor distributing wealth out of paternal goodwill.
None at all.
It is merely an administrator managing a collective pool of resources.
And if you are the sole owner of those resources, you are entitled to the unredacted receipts.
Precisely. But to understand where those receipts are typically hidden, Professor Pavlovich draws a sharp line between two distinct categories of government spending.
Mandatory spending and discretionary spending.
Right. Let's start with mandatory spending. This represents the rigid, predictable expenses required simply to keep the machinery of the state operational.
So we are talking about the salaries of public school teachers, standard social contributions, pensions.
The basic utility costs for government buildings.
Right. But I would assume that mandatory spending is still subject to significant bloat. I mean, a government agency might hire 50 administrators when it really only needs 10.
Sure.
Doesn't that also represent a misuse of public funds?
It absolutely represents inefficiency. And often it represents political patronage. But it is a different mechanism of obfuscation entirely.
How so?
Well, while a state agency might be bloated, the nature of mandatory spending leaves less room for fluid, untraceable financial manipulation.
Because it's predictable.
Exactly. You generally know how many employees are on the payroll. You know the standard civil service salary bands.
The money moves in a highly structured, recurring way.
Right. It is visible. Even if it is inefficient, you can see the bloat.
Which clarifies why the workshop focuses so heavily on the second category.
Discretionary spending.
Yes, because this is where politicians actually have agency.
Exactly. Discretionary spending involves the choices a government makes regarding new initiatives,
It's the funding allocated for building a new highway,
or granting agricultural subsidies,
initiating local municipal revitalization projects.
or hiring external private contractors for specialized services. Discretionary spending is, by definition, flexible.
Right. A city council might choose to repave 20 miles of road this year.
Or they might choose to repave none at all and instead construct a new sports arena.
And because the spending is optional and because it varies so wildly from year to year, it is highly susceptible to manipulation.
Highly susceptible. This is the arena where public-private partnerships are formed. It's where massive contracts are awarded to private construction firms.
It's where the most significant sums of public money cross the threshold into private hands.
Right. Therefore, this is the specific area where citizens must exercise absolute sovereignty over observing the flow of funds.
But currently, we don't have that sovereignty.
We really don't.
And to understand why, we need to look backward for a moment. The professors outlined a brief history of municipal and national budgets.
They mapped the evolution of transparency through 4 distinct phases.
Let's trace that timeline for you. It starts with Phase 1, which the professors refer to as the Weberian model.
The Weberian model dominated the 18th and 19th centuries, and this was an era characterized by total, uncompromising secrecy.
State budgets were simply not revealed to the public in any capacity whatsoever.
Right. The management of public funds was considered the exclusive, unquestionable domain of the sovereign.
The monarch, or the highest echelons of the state apparatus.
Exactly. In that era, the concept of the citizen as a stakeholder was vastly different, if it even existed at all.
The average person paying a tax on grain or land was not viewed as an investor in the state who deserved a quarterly earnings report.
Not at all. The budget was treated as a matter of national security and statecraft.
Suggesting that a commoner should review the state's ledgers would have been treated as an absurdity.
Or even treason.
Right. But as societies slowly democratized and the demands for basic civic rights increased, we transitioned into Phase 2.
Which the workshop defines as paper transparency.
This era arrived in the late 19th century and persisted throughout most of the 20th century, predating the digital revolution.
Governments began to concede that the public had some right to know, but they provided access in a highly restricted macroscopic format.
Budgets were published in official printed state gazettes.
Or massive physical volumes housed in government archives.
Imagine the friction involved in that system.
It was immense.
To see the budget, you would have to physically travel to a municipal building or a designated library.
You'd have to request the heavy-bound volume of the official gazette.
And pore over pages of tiny printed text.
And even if you made that effort, the level of detail was practically non-existent.
Right. The defining limitation of Phase 2 of paper transparency was the lump sum.
The lump sum. Exactly. You might locate a line item in the printed ledger that simply read $5 million for the Ministry of Defense.
Or $2 million for agricultural development.
It provided the public with broad categories, but offered zero granularity regarding how that money was actually distributed on the ground.
You knew the general direction the money was pointed.
But the final recipients,
The actual merchants, contractors, or landowners receiving those millions.
they remained completely shielded from public view.
It pacified the demand for transparency without actually providing accountability.
A very clever political compromise.
Which leads us directly to the system we live in today, Phase 3.
Online transparency.
Yes. This is the model implemented by most modern democratic societies right now.
The physical, dusty ledgers have been replaced by digital files. Budgets are published on government websites.
They are categorized by complex economic and functional classifications. Anyone with an internet connection can download them.
And on the surface, it feels like the ultimate victory for open government.
It carries the aesthetic of transparency.
It really does.
Yeah.
But the core argument presented in the workshop is that Phase 3 is highly deceptive.
We'll examine the actual mechanics of this deception in a moment, but the fundamental flaw of online transparency is that it provides the illusion of access without the substance of tracking.
It drowns you in a sea of disconnected data points, structured specifically to prevent meaningful forensic tracing.
Which brings us to the theoretical future. This is proposed by Professor Enck, Professor Pavlovich, and Ivka Bujovich.
Phase 4.
Deep transparency.
Right. And deep transparency requires a fundamental paradigm shift. It is defined as a system where citizens have real-time, frictionless access to the entire life cycle of public funds.
It moves far beyond merely viewing an approved budget document.
In this proposed phase, You can observe the initial budget proposal. You can track its adoption.
You monitor its execution.
And most importantly, you identify the ultimate, final recipients of every single grant, subsidy, and municipal contract.
It is the total eradication of the lump sum.
The end of the categorical veil.
But to truly grasp why a radical shift to deep transparency is necessary, we have to spend some time analyzing the profound failures of our current Phase 3 systems.
We need to dissect the illusion of online transparency.
Right. During the workshop, Professor Pavlovich moved the discussion from academic theory to practical reality.
He conducted a live demonstration using the actual proposed 2025 city budget for Novi Sad.
And he highlighted a phenomenon that we can call the dead PDF problem.
The dead PDF. This is crucial. When you visit a municipal website today to view the city budget, you are almost universally prompted to download a massive PDF document.
It might be hundreds of pages long.
Filled with dense tables, alphanumeric economic codes, functional classifications.
It looks rigorous.
It looks like accountability. But a PDF is, by its very nature, a static, dead document.
Let's follow the specific example presented in the source material to see how this plays out for a normal person trying to follow their tax money.
Okay.
Imagine you are a resident of Novi Sad. You hear the city has a 42 billion dinar budget, and you want to know where it is going.
So you open this massive PDF, you scroll through the endless tables, and you find a line item indicating that 3 billion dinars have been allocated to a category called subsidies.
You have the total figure 3 billion dinars.
And you have the broad economic category subsidies.
But the trail goes completely cold the moment you read that line.
Completely cold. Who specifically received those subsidies?
Was it distributed evenly among 1,000 small, struggling agricultural businesses?
Or was it handed as a massive single payout to one well-connected corporation?
The dead PDF cannot answer that.
You cannot interact with the document. You cannot click on the number 3 billion to reveal the underlying contracts, the applications, or the criteria for the awards.
It's just a dead number on a screen. But Professor Pavlovich drilled down into an even more specific and revealing example during his demonstration.
He did. He located a specific municipal program labeled traffic infrastructure. And this program carried an allocation of 77 million dinars.
When he looked at the breakdown of that 77 million within the economic classifications table, it showed 46 million dinars designated for current repairs.
And 28 million dinars for services by contract.
Now, if you are a citizen reading that breakdown, you naturally assume the city is spending tens of millions on the physical maintenance of the city.
You assume current repairs within a traffic infrastructure program means fixing potholes.
Repaving intersections.
Or maintaining traffic lights.
Yeah.
That is the logical conclusion drawn from the data provided.
It is. But Pavlovich didn't stop at the table. He took the specific 8-digit identification code associated with that 77 million dinar program and searched for it elsewhere in the massive document.
Because often, the narrative descriptions of these programs are buried dozens of pages away from the financial tables.
Disconnected and incredibly hard to match up.
Right. And when he finally located the narrative description for this specific code, the primary activity listed was not road repair.
It wasn't fixing potholes.
No. The primary measurable goal, the stated indicator of success for this 77 million dinar funding, was the training of 200 taxi drivers.
I mean, this is a textbook example of how the current system misdirects the public.
It really is.
How does the training of 200 taxi drivers logically relate to a 46 million dinar allocation categorized as current repairs?
It defies common sense. The budget provides the broad economic category, but actively obscures the true nature of the transaction.
You cannot click on the 28 million dinars allocated for services by contract to see which private driving school or consulting firm was awarded the contract to train these drivers.
Right. And I have to pause here because the implications are staggering.
They are.
Why would a city administration deliberately hide taxi driver training under current repairs? Is it simple bureaucratic incompetence? Or is there a political incentive for this kind of miscategorization?
Well, while incompetence is always a factor in large bureaucracies, consistent miscategorization of this magnitude often points to political incentives.
Because discretionary funds are frequently used for political patronage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By burying a highly specific, perhaps questionable contract.
Like paying a specific private company tens of millions to train taxi drivers.
Right, burying that under a boring, universally accepted category like current repairs, the administration avoids scrutiny.
No journalist or citizen is going to protest fixing potholes.
Exactly. If the true nature of the contract is hidden beneath that mundane label, the funds can be directed to favored contractors with minimal pushback.
You are left with a series of vital questions that the online budget is specifically designed not to answer.
Who got the money?
What physical infrastructure was actually repaired, if any,
How much did it cost to train a single taxi driver?
and was at a competitive market rate?
The Phase 3 system creates an optical illusion. It gives you a 100-page document filled with numbers, satisfying the legal requirement for transparency.
While effectively burying the most critical piece of information.
The final destination of the public funds.
And if a highly motivated citizen realizes this and decides they want to find the actual contract to see who got paid, they are forced into the next layer of the current administrative maze.
The public procurement portal?
Right. The workshop spent considerable time addressing this reality.
Because procurement portals do exist, and theoretically, they house the actual contracts.
But the practical reality of using them is an entirely different story.
Professor Pavlovich described the process of navigating a current public procurement portal as requiring 3 days of writing.
It is a labyrinth.
Having tried to use some of these municipal databases myself, I can attest to the frustration. You encounter drop-down menus that don't load.
Session links that expire after 5 minutes of inactivity.
Proprietary file formats that standard computers struggle to open.
It is a system that feels deliberately hostile to the user.
It's an exercise in attrition. If you want to find the contract for the taxi driver training, you cannot seamlessly link to it from the budget PDF.
No, you have to open a separate portal, which may require you to create an account or navigate a complex registration process.
Then you have to initiate a search through thousands of disparate procurement decisions.
You have to attempt to match obscure alphanumeric identification codes from the budget document with the often completely different codes used in the procurement database.
You are looking for a needle in a haystack, and the architecture of the portal seems designed to continuously dump more hay on top of you.
And even if you manage to find a notice stating that a contract was awarded, you might not find the actual scanned contract detailing the unit costs, the deliverables, or the performance penalties.
The entire burden of forensic accounting is placed squarely on the shoulders of you, the citizen, using tools that discourage inquiry at every step.
This represents the fundamental critique of Phase 3 transparency. It provides fragmented data, but it purposefully restricts the relationships between those data points.
You can view the budget in one place,
And somewhere else you might eventually uncover a procurement contract.
but connecting the two requires an unreasonable investment of time, specialized knowledge, and sheer persistence.
This intentional disconnect, the gap between the budget line item and the final contract, is the fertile ground where corruption, political favoritism, and massive systemic inefficiency thrive.
So if the problem is dead data, static PDFs, and purposefully unlinked procurement systems, how do we fundamentally fix it?
This is the pivot point of the workshop, where Professor Anchink and Njegomir introduced the technical architecture for Phase 4.
Deep transparency.
Right. The core concept requires a total abandonment of how we currently view financial reporting. We must stop treating the municipal or national budget as a static document.
And begin treating it as a live, continuous, distributed database.
To comprehend why this architecture is necessary, we have to trace the complex, convoluted path that money takes within a state system.
Which Boyovich detailed in his presentation.
Because the flow of public money is not a straight line from the taxpayer to the final project.
Not at all. Money comes into the system through various unified inputs, your income taxes, property taxes, administrative fees.
It pools centrally.
Yeah.
But it is then distributed across a massive interwoven web.
First, the money is distributed according to broad public policies. These represent the macro goals of the state.
Agricultural development,
Public health,
national education.
traffic infrastructure.
From those high-level policy buckets, the funds flow down to the budget users.
These are the actual operational institutions, the state ministries, regional authorities, local city secretariats, public agencies.
And this is where the tracking becomes exponentially difficult.
Because a single budget user, for example, a local municipal secretariat for transportation, might receive funds from multiple different public policy categories simultaneously.
Right. They might receive money intended for infrastructure maintenance, but also a separate stream of money intended for environmental protection initiatives.
And from those budget users, the money finally flows out to the end point.
The final recipients.
These are the private construction companies, the external contractors, the non-governmental organizations, or the private individuals who are actually performing the work, delivering the goods, or receiving the subsidy.
This creates an incredibly tangled matrix.
A single private construction company might receive 50 different distinct payments from 20 different government budget users,
Originating from 5 different public policy categories.
all over the course of a single fiscal year.
In our current Phase 3 system, tracking that single private company's total income from the state across all those different nodes is nearly impossible without subpoena power.
The fragmented databases simply do not talk to each other.
But the architecture of deep transparency solves this by digitizing and universally linking every single node in that web.
It's to ensure that this live linked database cannot be manipulated by the very government officials operating it. Schenk and Boyovich propose building the system on 2 foundational technologies.
The first is worm technology.
Let's ensure we are defining this technical terms clearly for you. WORM is an acronym. It stands for Write Once, Read Many.
The concept is that data can be written into the storage medium, but once it is there, can never be rewritten, altered, or erased.
In a traditional relational computer database, the kind most governments currently use, a system administrator or an official with correct privileges can access a record and alter it.
If a municipal contract was initially entered into the database with a value of 1 million dinars, a corrupt official could theoretically log in, delete that entry, and replace it with a value of 10 million dinars.
Or they could erase the record entirely to hide a transaction.
The traditional database simply overwrites the old information with the new, leaving no trace of the original entry.
But wait, if worm memory is truly permanent and cannot be deleted, what happens in the case of simple human error?
That's a good question.
Let's say a clerk is entering a legitimate contract, and they make an honest typo. They accidentally enter 100 million instead of 10 million. If they can't delete it, isn't the system permanently broken?
That is exactly why this system relies on the concept of an append-only ledger. You never delete the mistake. You issue a permanent time-stamped amendment.
I see.
If the clerk makes a typo, they must enter a new, separate record correcting the error. The system retains the original erroneous entry, and it retains the new correcting entry. Both are permanently visible.
This is crucial because it preserves the entire history of actions.
Exactly. If a public project requires an annex to a contract because costs have overrun,
Which happens constantly in public works.
constantly, that annex is written as a new entry. The system retains the original contract, the original projected cost, and the new annex.
It eliminates the technical ability of anyone to secretly scrub the archives or alter history.
Every working draft, every typo, and every modification is preserved permanently.
That addresses the physical storage of the data. But if this system is managed by the state, how do you prove to a skeptical public that the worm database itself hasn't been tampered with?
Right.
What stops a regime from simply unplugging the real worm drive and plugging in a counterfeit drive filled with fabricated data?
That is where the second foundational technology is introduced, blockchain.
Now, when most people hear the word blockchain, they immediately associate it with cryptocurrency.
Bitcoin or financial speculation.
But the professors are proposing blockchain purely for its foundational utility.
As an immutable, mathematically verifiable public ledger.
As new pieces of data, contracts, payments, invoices are written into the worm memory, they are mathematically grouped together into what are called blocks.
Each block is cryptographically sealed and encryptably linked to the specific mathematical signature of the block that came immediately before it.
Forming a continuous chain.
Right.
Let's push back on this a bit, though, acting as the skeptic.
Sure.
If a corrupt official manages to enter a completely fabricated invoice into the system from the start, a lie, doesn't the blockchain just perfectly and permanently preserve a lie?
That is a vital distinction to make. Blockchain guarantees data immutability, not data veracity.
It cannot verify if the invoice is physically true in the real world.
No, it can only guarantee that the data, exactly as it was entered, has never been altered. But that immutability is the trap.
How so?
Well, if the corrupt official enters a fake invoice for 5 million dinars, they cannot go back 2 years later and delete it when a journalist starts asking questions.
The lie is trapped in amber.
Exactly. Because the blockchain makes the ledger public and permanent, the lie is exposed to continuous automated audit by anyone who wishes to look.
If someone attempted to hack the system and alter a single comma in a contract from 3 years ago, the mathematical signature of that specific block would change.
And because every subsequent block relies on that exact signature,
Yeah.
the entire chain would instantly fracture.
Broadcasting an undeniable mathematical alarm to the public that tampering had occurred.
You no longer have to trust the government official. You rely on the mathematical proof.
Now, a system this radically open naturally invites serious questions regarding privacy and national security.
And the professors did not shy away from this nuance during the workshop. They acknowledged that not every single state expenditure can or should be broadcast to the global internet.
Security and intelligence expenditures are the prime examples.
Right. If a national intelligence agency is procuring specific munitions, funding undercover operations, or purchasing highly specialized cybersecurity software,
Revealing the exact technical specifications, the quantities, and the identities of the suppliers could pose a severe and legitimate threat to national security.
the architecture they propose accounts for this reality. Sensitive security data is still entered into the system,
It is still recorded on the immutable worm memory.
and it is still cryptographically verified by the blockchain.
This is critical because it means intelligence funds cannot simply be embezzled without a permanent, immutable record being created.
However, the public-facing access to those specific, highly classified line items is restricted.
Only authorized personnel, for example, members of a parliamentary intelligence oversight committee possessing the correct cryptographic clearance keys, would have the ability to unencrypt and read those specific files.
It is essential to contextualize those security exemptions, though. They represent a very small fraction of the overall state budget.
The vast majority of government spending, the local infrastructure projects, the municipal trash collection contracts,
The agricultural subsidies.
the public health procurement, the local roundabout construction.
This is all civilian discretionary spending.
And under the deep transparency architecture, 100% of that civilian spending becomes entirely, permanently, and frictionlessly open to the public.
So, we have established the theoretical backend. A tamper-proof, fully linked, live distributed database containing every financial action of the state, secured by worm memory and blockchain.
But how does this actually help you, the listener?
Right. You are not a database engineer.
You don't have the time or the specialized knowledge to write complex SQL queries to track municipal spending patterns.
If the data is just sitting in a massive, mathematically sealed vault, it isn't much better than the dead PDF.
This is where the genius of the citizen interface comes into play. The final layer of the proposed architecture is how the public actually interacts with the data.
Instead of forcing the citizen to learn a complex search syntax, navigate unyielding drop-down menus, or understand procurement identification codes,
The system utilizes an artificial intelligence interface.
you simply ask the AI a question in plain language, the same way you would ask a human research assistant.
Let's walk through the scenario presented in the workshop. Imagine you are curious about a specific private enterprise in your town. Let's call them Company X.
They seem to constantly win contracts to repave roads, maintain parks, and provide consulting services.
You open the interface on your smartphone, and you simply type or say, how much total money did Company X receive from all state ministries and local municipalities combined this year, and what were the specific projects?
Behind the scenes, the AI translates your natural language request into a complex, multi-layered database query.
Remember the tangled web of budget users we discussed?
Right. The data isn't sitting on one single centralized server. It is distributed across the individual nodes of hundreds of different budget users.
The local secretariats, the state ministries, the regional public agencies.
The AI uses secure virtual private networks, or VPNs, to instantly and securely reach out to all of these distributed databases simultaneously.
The VPNs ensure that the AI can securely access the internal records of these agencies without exposing the agency's operational servers to the public internet.
It scans the ledgers of the Ministry of Transportation, the local municipal water authority, the Ministry of Education,
Rapidly searching for any transaction mathematically linked to Company X.
The AI performs the exhaustive investigative work that would normally take a team of human forensic accountants months to complete.
It aggregates the data from across the entire state apparatus.
It might discover that Company X didn't just win one highly publicized, easily visible 10 million dinar contract for a new school roof.
The AI might uncover that Company X also received 15,000 separate minor payments of 5,000 dinars each,
For vaguely defined consulting services.
spread across 20 different local municipal bodies.
This is a crucial point. Corrupt systems often operate just below the threshold of oversight.
A 10 million dinar contract might require a public tender and committee approval.
But a 5,000 dinar contract might be approved by a mid-level manager with absolutely no oversight.
By securing thousands of these micro contracts, a company can drain massive amounts of public money completely unnoticed by the current Phase 3 systems.
Exactly. The AI gathers all of this fragmented data, cross-references it, checks the blockchain signature of every single transaction to guarantee that none of the records have been tampered with since they were entered.
And it synthesizes the findings. Within seconds, it delivers a clear, distilled, undeniable forensic report directly to your screen.
You receive a comprehensive dossier. You see the total aggregate sum Company X received.
You see a breakdown of exactly which government agencies paid them.
You see from which specific public policy budgets the money originated.
And most importantly, you are provided with direct links to the original, unalterable PDF contracts and annexes for every single project, large or small.
It effectively democratizes forensic accounting. It grants every single citizen the investigative power of a state auditor, accessible instantly from their pocket.
It takes the frustrating 3 days of writing through a hostile procurement portal and reduces it to a 5-second plain language query.
This brings us to the climax of the university workshop. After presenting this elegant, mathematically sound, and technologically feasible architecture, the professors opened the floor to the audience for questions.
And this is where the pristine theoretical architecture violently collided with harsh political reality.
An audience member offered a profound and deeply pragmatic challenge.
They had listened to the entire presentation, understood the technology, and essentially asked, "This is a beautiful dream, but it requires the political class to adopt it and implement it."
Why would any politician in any country, regardless of their party affiliation, ever willingly implement a system that completely eradicates their ability to manipulate funds, distribute patronage, and hide their financial maneuvers from the public?
It is the ultimate reality check.
It really is. The audience member correctly pointed out that the current obscure, clunky Phase 3 system is not an accident.
The dead PDFs and the labyrinthine procurement portals are not the result of technological ignorance.
No, they are a feature carefully designed and maintained by the people in power to protect themselves and their patronage networks.
Asking politicians to voluntarily install deep transparency is like asking a stage magician to perform all of their illusions inside a brightly lit glass box.
They will never willingly agree to expose their own mechanics.
The professors did not dismiss this challenge.
In fact, they entirely agreed with the premise.
They acknowledged that waiting for an entrenched, self-interested political class to voluntarily legislate away their own power and flexibility is a fool's errand.
You cannot petition a corrupt system to fix itself.
Instead, the professors offered a deeply strategic, long-term response. They outlined what we can describe as a strategy of obsolescence.
The philosophy they presented is highly actionable. You do not ask the government for permission, and you do not wait for a sympathetic politician to champion the cause.
You build the tool independently.
The academic sector, the technical community, and civic engineers collaborate to design the actual functioning architecture of deep transparency.
Once the architecture is built, you subject it to the most rigorous intellectual stress tests available.
You publish the technical specifications, the source code, the mathematical proofs of the worm memory integrity,
and the blockchain verification protocols in highly respected international, peer-reviewed scientific and technical journals.
You invite global academic scrutiny to prove, undeniably, that the system works exactly as claimed.
You mathematically prove that deep transparency is not science fiction.
Nor is it a beautiful dream.
It is a highly practical, achievable reality using software and hardware that exists right now.
Once the technical proof is published and globally validated, you bypass the politicians entirely and take the system directly to the public.
You conduct workshops, just like the one Shink and Pavlovich hosted.
You explain the mechanics.
Yeah.
You show the taxpayer exactly how much investigative power they are currently being denied by the Phase 3 system.
And you demonstrate how easily that power could be granted to them.
The ultimate goal is to create a civic tool so flawlessly designed, so mathematically secure, and so obviously beneficial to the average taxpayer that it sparks a fundamental shift in public expectation.
By proving that the black box of government spending can be opened easily and securely, you strip away the political class's primary defense.
Politicians can no longer hide behind technical excuses.
They can no longer stand at a podium and claim, the budget is too complicated for the average citizen to understand.
Or the technology simply doesn't exist to track every single transaction securely.
Because the independent technical community has already proven that it does.
You expose the uncomfortable truth. The only reason the government is not using deep transparency is because they actively choose to keep the public in the dark.
You force the issue. You maneuver the political establishment into a corner.
When the public truly understands that absolute real-time financial transparency is technologically simple, they will begin to demand it.
It shifts from being a fringe academic concept to a standard condition of the public's vote.
Eventually, a political entity, sensing the shift in public demand, will adopt the deep transparency architecture as their primary platform to gain power.
And if the entrenched politicians refuse to accept the transparent system, they face public obsolescence.
The technology itself becomes the wedge that forces the political evolution.
You don't change the politicians' minds. You change the technological environment in which they are forced to operate.
Making secrecy politically unviable.
We have covered an immense amount of ground in this deep dive.
We certainly have.
We started with the foundational assumption that the state budget is, in its entirety, our money, intended for the common good.
We traced the long history of how we have been systematically locked out of understanding how that money is spent.
Moving from the total secrecy of the Weberian model through the pacifying lump sums of paper gazettes to the deeply frustrating optical illusion of dead PDFs and tangled portals we navigate today.
And we thoroughly examined the architectural key that could finally open that black box.
A live, distributed database secured by permanent worm memory and mathematically immutable blockchain, navigated seamlessly by an AI forensic tool.
It is a proposed system that definitively shifts the immense burden of transparency away from the exhausted citizen and places it squarely back onto the state, where it rightfully belongs.
It is a radical vision for the future of civic engagement, but as we discussed, it is technologically within our grasp at this very moment.
The barrier preventing Phase 4 is no longer a lack of software or hardware. It is purely a lack of political will.
The shift to deep transparency will not happen quietly or voluntarily, but the strategy of obsolescence provides a roadmap for forcing that necessary evolution.
It is a critical step if we ever hope to move beyond the systemic obfuscation of municipal and national spending.
As we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave you with a highly specific thought to ponder.
We've spent this time discussing macro theories, architectural frameworks, and historical phases.
But consider the immediate practical reality of the community where you live. Think about the roads you drive on, the municipal services you use, and the local businesses that always seem to secure city contracts.
If this deep transparency AI tool were fully implemented in your own local city or national government tomorrow morning,
what is the very first specific expenditure, local infrastructure project, or private company you would ask it to investigate?
it is a highly revealing question. Because almost everyone has that one specific local project, the roundabout that took 4 years to finish, the consultant who was paid for a report no one read that they have always deeply wondered about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of transparency. Until next time, keep questioning the systems around you.